Hello, everyone. We'll just give another minute to let other people come straggle in. All right, let's see a few more people making their way in. We'll just give it another minute. We'll get started. Okay, we'll go ahead and make a start. I think a few more people will trickle in as we get going. That's okay. Welcome, everyone, to our presentation of the report that we have recently released. So, On the Precipice, Sustainability in an Age of Uncertainty, a cheery title to match the times if I've ever heard one. Um, Today, we're going to talk you through just some key themes of the report. If you haven't read it, we'll make sure that you get a link on the back side of this so you can read it in more detail yourselves. Um, and just in quick summary, the report was featured a survey and interviews of COO or VPFNA type roles in universities across the UK, Australia, and Canada. Terminology is obviously quite different, and the roles are slightly different across those jurisdictions. So appreciate that some of the themes may resonate differently here than they do in some of the other locations where we got feedback. Quick introductions. I'm Matt Durnin from Nous Group. I lead our higher education practice in North America out of Toronto. I'm joined by my colleague Bruno Henderyckx from the Nous Data Insights team, formerly known as Cubane. Um, okay, if we can just, I can navigate the slides. Start with a quick land acknowledgement. I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm sitting right now on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples. And it's now the home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by the Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Uh, Obviously, we're in very challenging times for universities. I probably don't need to tell any of you that. I think maybe something that you're not aware of in your day-to-day work is how similar the situation is across the other major Anglophone countries. Similar situations in all of the jurisdictions we work in. Our first report in this series was launched in 2023. And you can see the comparison of the levels of concern over financial sustainability in 2023 versus today. So you can see that very sharp rise in those saying expecting significantly worse financial performance and those experiencing worse financial performance from 2 years ago to this year. So six themes emerged in this report, digging further into that issue of financial sustainability that we want to explore today. So the first one is around steering the ship. So professional service leaders, the CEO or VPFNA role is increasingly in the spotlight as you're having to make very difficult decisions and often very public decisions about what needs to change in universities. There's a greater need also to work more closely as a sector, whether that be in terms of lobbying or in creative ways of working to reduce costs and sharing costs across institutions. We've also seen a broader efficiency remit grow over the last couple of years. So those financial difficulties have meant that there is a greater intention and interest in pursuing financial efficiencies where there haven't been previously because of budget shortfalls and particularly the downturn in revenue. Again, that being common across all of the jurisdictions we work in, the UK and Australia, also impacted by changes to international recruitment policies that have decreased revenue, as well as being in very challenging inflationary environments since the pandemic. We've also, the other thing we want to explore is collaboration across portfolios, that being increasingly important um, to align the academic expectations with the ambitions and realities across the rest of the institution. And five, on the physical infrastructure, we've seen an increasing importance of the attention to use of space and managing an increasingly challenging portfolio of physical assets as they age. And then finally, the sixth theme is digital disappointments to AI adoption. So huge investments in digital infrastructure over the last decade, in particular for institutions here and in other places. A lot of potential investment needed or wanted over the next 10 years as we look ahead at the AI space, but looking back at that very challenging view of return on an investment from what was spent and invested in the last decade. Okay. So while the role of professional services has evolved in institutions in recent years, from lead administrators to and managers to strategic partners, it increasingly involves co-leading large and complex organizations through a pretty turbulent time. Um, really critical part of this is enhancing financial literacy across the institution and bringing discipline and good management to all departments and across the university. Um, it's increasingly important as well that we focus on long-term thinking, even though we're faced with short-term challenges. And so in terms of the most important areas for professional services in the next 5 years, what came to the top in the survey was leading transformational change. So we have seen increased attention to that space, followed by increasing service efficiency, and then improving the effectiveness of services coming in third. Some of the feedback we heard in the interviews, and I think this first one will resonate with a lot of people on the call, that a lot of CEOs, COOs, and VPFNAs uh, felt like they increasingly have a target on their back, being put in this position of having to make very public and very impactful decisions across the institution in tough economic times. As the middle quote points out, um, the CEO portfolio often sits at the center of all of the policy changes coming from government. They all intersect with that role in some way or another, and that's made the role increasingly challenging in recent years. And then finally, from the CEO at a UK university, highlighting um, what a much more public role this has been, similar to that first comment from our Canadian colleague about it being a very visible and often a role that attracts a lot of attention and blame in when difficult decisions have to be made. So in quick summary here, I'll let you read through these bullet points individually, but what we have found in terms of best practice and what we've learned from other institutions as well is that when you're not in a position to prescribe a direction across the institution, and particularly if you're working in a very decentralized environment like what we find in a lot of Canadian institutions, your best option can be focusing on providing better data and tools to drive better decision making across the university. Whether that be rolling out dashboards, providing financial training through your business partners and to faculties. All of these things can help orient the university in the right direction, even when you can't directly control every piece of it. Okay. Bruno, I'll hand it over to you to talk us through the next section.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you, Matt. And I'm happy to be here on this afternoon to be able to present kind of the results and the teams that emerged from our CEO survey. I think the second team, basically, I think Matt highlighted the financial pressures I think universities are navigating through pretty equally globally. So I think in all the regions that we support, there's some serious financial constraints. So I think the second team that came out of that is obviously from our CEOs and VP FNAs is that team of working more together as a sector, right? So gather strengths in kind of leveraging the strength as a sector as a whole and combining those efforts. I think if you think about working together as a sector, that can be quite multifaceted in terms of ranging from things that I think many Canadian institutions or North American institutions currently are already doing and doing it even better to things that I think could be quite complex to pull off as well, where kind of the return on investment might be significant. So I think if you think through that spectrum, I think if we think about things that are relatively easier and where there's fundamentally already efforts in place that universities are doing is, for example, joint advocacy to governments, communicating the value of higher education to government, but as well the public more broadly. And I think an interesting reflection on that specific point is kind of in the middle quote there from an Australian CEO, where they get a feeling of no longer being believed about the severity of the real financial pressures institutions are facing in the short term, right? And I think certainly within the Canadian context, there is some, for example, I think unfair blaming of institutions on international students on the housing crisis, for example. There's a bit of a perception crisis, I think, there when you look at higher education more broadly. I think effectively combating that, as well as signaling to the public and the different governments within the Canadian sector of the severity of some of the financial challenges is going to be key. Another way that I think the sector will be able to work together more structurally is, for example, on the procurement front as well, right? In terms of opportunities to go to suppliers together and combine purchasing powers, especially for institutions that are geographically more closely related to each other. I think similarly, if you think about research, areas like research infrastructure, there are opportunities there, I think, as a sector that we could better leverage. And then I think finally, we're kind of thinking about maybe more complex things, like, for example, merging back office processes, right? In terms of finance, HR, IT, so your typical corporate activities. I think certainly within a North American context, if you look more broadly, I'm based in Washington, D.C. So an example in kind of the US is context is there are quite a few systems in the US context that have established very well working shared services across multiple institutions. Think of, for example, the University of California system, who also integrates even their health component in their shared service center, right? So I think we've seen a bit more proliferation of those type of ITs starting to emerge. And then even beyond that, I think if you look across other markets, very public and very broad mergers starting to happen between universities. So for example, in the Australian context, you have the University of Adelaide and the University of South Australia recently merging. So I think across that entire spectrum, I think when we engage with CEOs, VPFNAs, across the interviews that we conducted for this survey, I think we found a greater willingness or an appetite to really start thinking about, I think, how as professional services leaders, we can kind of leverage the collective power and the interinstitutional kind of integration in the future to start doing things differently. Um, I think it must be said, I think, that many interviewees noted as well that there are and there remain significant both cultural and I would say operational barriers to overcome if you start thinking about some of the more complex stuff. So, for example, I think when you think about merging back office functions together, HR, IT, that might sound quite easy to do, but I think in reality, just because of the proliferation of different systems, different processes, even within institutions, multiple ways of running payrolls, for example, might be quite difficult to actually be able to pull off in the short term. So really thinking through what the cost benefit analysis is of that, I think is going to be really critical for professional service leaders as they kind of explore what is available for them to kind of pursue in terms of the breadth of working together more as a system. I'm curious, Matt, I think in terms of kind of your experiences recently with some of the work in Ontario, Any thoughts kind of in terms of that back office integration that you've recently led?
Yeah, and for context, we've recently completed a lot of the efficiency and accountability fund projects across Ontario, both with universities and colleges. I think learnings from that is on an institutional level. Um, with the larger, particularly research-intensive universities, there can be some pretty substantial opportunities to centralize or consolidate to some degree back office or transactional services. In the smaller, relatively smaller institutions, we've seen less opportunity there. Um, what we found is that most are quite lean on the administrative side already. Probably some lagging investment there, held back by some pretty outdated systems as well. Um, I think one of the things that the ministry's been really interested in here has been, and we've heard this from other governments, is pushing on the idea of combining back office functions across institutions. Um, there is, I think, particularly on procurement, we've seen some pretty productive collaborations there. I think realistically, though, when you look at where universities have had tried to bring together other back office functions, the benefits have been a lot. They've accrued, but they've been a lot smaller than what people have expected going into it. And I think, your colleagues in Nova Scotia can speak to some of that and one of the projects that was run in that province. We've seen it in the UK as well. There are some benefits, but I think they're often smaller than what our provincial governments would like them to be. And it's quite a bit of work in terms of setting up and coming to agreement on who's going to cut what, who's going to take which services forward, and how that will be split up across institutions. So a lot of work for what we often see as a fairly moderate gain, but some more obvious opportunities, particularly around shared procurement. That's kind of an obvious one to pursue further.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think that is quite similar belief to the experience we see as well on the data insight side. I'd say certainly if you look at the professional services sides, I think there are still plenty of opportunities as well, just looking within our institutions, right, in terms of to pursue there. So I think that's certainly an important first step, I think, in the short term for institutions to pursue. I think that kind of aligns pretty well, I would say, with the next emerging team, team number 3 there, which really talks about having, I think, a broader efficiency remit than maybe VPFNAs had in the past. So I think out of all the conversations across the regions, I think one of those common themes was, of course, that there's a lot of pressure on managing the cost base as being very critical in the short-term priority, with a lot of the revenue levers being very unexpectedly kind of closed off or shut down. I think survey respondents, you can see there on the chart, for example, now indicate that those short-term pressures are forcing them to look more towards the improvement of efficiency of support service. So that's kind of the highest rated there on the right-hand side. So that is a very obvious area of focus, but also increasingly looking at, I think, program costs in general, be it just to bring some transparency in terms of the program offer and the cost associated with that. So I think those, especially the latter one, were conversations that are starting to happen much more, I think, what we've seen recently across institutions. And they have historically sometimes been kind of anathemas to many universities, I think, to even bring up, but they are increasingly starting to become just conversations. And one of the very data points that you might consider when you look at your overall kind of program offering. I think key here on this chart as well is just a stark contrast, I would say, compared to 2023 in the blue bars, where you see a much higher emphasis, I think, in terms of revenue generating activities, right? So I think, for example, we saw there increasing tuition fees still being significantly considered in 2023, international enrollment expansion as well. I think obviously within a Canadian context, maybe not a surprise here how the revenue side, obviously through our various different government layers have been shut off to a certain extent. So obviously on the provincial level, it really depends, but you continue to have tuition freezes or operating grants not keeping up with inflation. And then on the federal level, obviously, everybody is well aware of the visa caps, which kind of work differently on a province by province basis. But I think all to say that I think that belief in only the revenue side being a solution here is probably no longer there, and there's a much higher emphasis now on actually managing your cost base effectively as an institution. And I think very critical is that going to be for professional service leaders in the next, I think right now in the next year or so to really manage and soften some of the impacts on the bottom line from the visa caps. I think very key here, I think as well, is that professional service leaders want to do this without compromising on the institution's academic and social mission. So that's certainly, I think, no mean feat in terms of trying to accomplish that, right? So I think ultimately we want sustainable institutions, but managing that in a kind of a social and in an academic ways is quite important, which is a good segue, I think, into team 4 that emerged from the survey, which talks about collaboration by default. So I think that team is talking about the idea of if you want to pull off and kind of reimagine the way universities are conducting their business, I think it's critical to have that cross-portfolio collaboration down within your institution. And I would say that's absolutely imperative, I think, if you want to succeed in making change happen at the institution. So bridging that divide between both academic and professional services leaders, I think, has become an even higher priority as you try to navigate some of these short-term pressures. Obviously, I think professional services leaders are struggling to align those financial priorities with both academic expectations, institutional objectives. So it's a tight fine rope. It's a fine tightrope. I think many institutions are trying to walk as well. Not always from a professional service leader perspective, having the remits to work end to end across the university. So that's kind of baked in that there needs to be collaboration as a default, basically, to be able to work and pull that off. I'd say key there is cultivating, I'd say, the culture required to collaborate. So that includes effective change management, active co-leadership, all will be very necessary to land those transformational pieces of work that I think many institutions have embarked on more recently. I think that kind of perfectly aligns with some of the sentiments that you can see on the slide here from, I'd say, those two Canadian VPFNAs in the middle and the bottom of the slide. So the middle one kind of speaks to the fact that accountants need to be able to speak to academics and vice versa, right? So we need to be able to speak each other languages. But there also needs to be kind of accountability between those two. So in terms of the service providers and the service recipients, right, there needs to be, I think, an accountability between both of those sides. And then the second, so the bottom one, really key, I think, as well in terms of highlighting how important it is for the provost and the VPFA to be aligned in terms of what the goal and the vision is of the institution going forward. So I think those are great examples, I think, of maybe why on slide 14 in the survey, you can really see an emphasis in the latest results really on that cross-portfolio collaboration. So you can see in the second from the right-hand side, a 30-point increase in respondents indicating that that's very important in terms of the role priorities for professional service leaders, right? I interpret that, I think, as professional service leaders are now really valuing kind of doers and no longer thinkers. So I think the short-term pressures are that significant that I think many are looking for people to be able to navigate our complex institutions, be able to work together across the aisle and be able to accomplish those things together. And I think in order to do that very effectively, so to be kind of a great cross-portfolio collaborator, I think there's a few tactics and strategies that we've seen work very well across both the Work Nows and Nows Data Insights have been doing. I think one of that I briefly touched on is kind of that idea of modeling effective partnerships between provosts, deans, other academic leaders within an institution, as well as professional service leaders. there being kind of an idea and reinforcing the co-ownership on the collective responsibilities of leading and delivering those change initiatives. I think many of the most successful change initiatives we've seen work, as well as Matt, for example, and our colleagues have been working on, is where both the academic and the professional side of the house really co-championed and co-authored change initiatives. I think not too long ago, we've seen quite a few institutions as well go through, for example, budget model rework. And I think a real emphasis in all of that budget model work was building in more collaboration, I think, between academic and professional staff and really embeds kind of that shared accountability into those budget models, where they evolved from being quite, I'd say, directive and top-down, maybe more collaborative and supporting the mission and vision as the institution. And I think the final thing as well, it obviously is kind of, when you look at the value professional services staff are delivering, obviously that also could mean supporting and strengthening, for example, both the teaching and the research offer, and kind of alleviating some of the pressures on academics, where we see maybe some downloading of more of your administrative tasks on academics. So you can do that, for example, by investing in teaching capability investments, teaching design, investing in research infrastructure. I think all ways to kind of build goodwill with academics and making sure that they're well supported in their roles and in conducting research and teaching. So I think those are kind of all a few examples, I think, of good strategies and ideas that we've seen being quite effective and instrumental in trying to kind of collaborate more by default as an institution. I think keys here, when we speak to many university leaders, I think we hear signaling that really institutions are no longer able to afford operating as fiefdoms on their own, as kind of little islands that don't interact or that work very independently. I think there's kind of a realization to really need to break down existing silos and just work together significantly as an institution, as we're charting kind of new paths for institutions. Um, I'd say one key caveat before I hand it over back to Matt on the slides, and I think Matt kind of signaled it a little bit earlier as well, is the importance of of kind of avoiding looking down the line and pursuing your strategy. You can see kind of a stark decrease in that strategy as being a very high priority. And of course, I think that makes sense in terms of a short-term priority. You want to start making change happen. That change doesn't need to be perfect from the first go, but you want to kind of start building that change muscle. But I think there's inherently a risk if we kind of forgo thinking about the strategic side and kind of that North Star too much. So I'd say many institutions that have been effective at making change happen, I think they do that with keeping in mind what their long-term teaching and research mission is, right? So I think the key here as an institution is to decide, with that new fiscal reality, how can we best going forward kind of execute on that teaching and research mission? And that could mean investing in certain areas, but that could also mean making difficult trade-offs in terms of disinvesting in others. So I think keeping that strategy in mind as we want doers is probably going to be key as well in the next couple of years. And I think with that note, Matt, I'll hand it over back to you to speak to kind of the last couple of themes that I think emerged from the survey.
Thanks, Bruno. And as we're moving into theme 5, 2 themes left. So if you want to go ahead and start thinking about any questions you have and putting them in the Q&A chat, we'll get to those after we wrap up the next 4 slides or so. Theme 5 that emerged was on managing aging assets. The physical assets in particular, when we worked on the Efficiency and Accountability Fund projects here in Ontario, we saw a lot of government emphasis on physical infrastructure. I think they really thought a lot of the answers would be there. I think in our experience, there are things that can be achieved. They often take a long time to realize any financial benefit from changes in the portfolio, but some obvious things to pursue nonetheless. In terms of what the survey said, so 54% of universities had reduced their capital investments over the last year. We saw, 26%, a change from 26 to 16% in terms of those that significantly increased. Again, we're looking at a survey pool from across the UK and Australia as well, and to a greater degree than what we've seen in Canada, that build out of capital expenditure was really fueled by international tuition fees. I think something that some of those institutions likely regret a bit now, proceeding with some of those capital projects. Um, the broader problem we have is a lot of aging infrastructure is highlighted here, and challenges on what to do with that. At the same time, opportunities in terms of how we reimagine campus space, with improving digital infrastructure and changing delivery modes. So a couple of quotes here, things that surfaced in the interviews. So first from this VPFA at a Canadian institution, emphasizing that a lot of the campus facilities are over 200 years old, with climate change causing more volatility in the weather. I think here in Ontario, we've gone from our what coldest May in 65 years to 36, 37 the last few days. So we've gotten some of that volatility, but just understanding that with the hurricanes coming, the effects of those coming each fall for this institution, that increasing stress on physical facilities. So a need to invest at a time when we're also being forced to make cuts. So a challenging balance to strike. One of our Australian COOs said that, pointed out that you have agile work environments now. That's going to be the future state. There is some efforts to kind of repurpose that teaching space. That's again a very long-term change in the campus footprint. That's not something that can happen quickly. The holy grail in this respondent's view is academic offices. I think those of you, mostly Canadians on the call, will get a good chuckle at that. Obviously incredibly impossible to incredibly difficult to address in most of our institutions, where that's the faculty office square meterage is often specified in collective agreement. So it's quite difficult to change, even if those spaces are being underutilized now. So that's not likely where the changes happen immediately, but we do see greater opportunities to make better use of administrative space, where we're seeing some of that underutilized. Um, I think a lot more attention on timetabling solutions, smart timetabling, using technological solutions like that to make sure that space is well utilized as well. And then finally, from the perspective of another Australian COO, that just pointing out that it's a balance between safety considerations and staff and student experiences. And I think this just points again to the difficult position that university leaders are being put in at a time when cuts have to happen, and yet being faced with a lot of chronic underfunding of maintenance on campus facilities at the same time. A few things that emerged, more than a few, 10 things that emerged from our learnings from the efficiency and accountability fund work we did in Ontario, summarized here. The one thing I'll draw out a bit more from this list is particularly on selling and decommissioning surplus buildings, or deploying multi-use approaches, or striking new commercial deals with for sharing the use of space, leasing space. One thing we found is that in quite a few cases, those functions, the facilities functions, were so understaffed there that we were dragging out timelines to start realizing um, lower facilities costs or new facilities income that could be brought forward by several years just by adding one FTE at a relatively um, mid-level, to drive some of these projects forward. So it's a challenging conversation to have at a time when you're often having to make staff cuts, but there are some very sensible investments in FTE that can very quickly translate into much larger financial contributions or savings if we can move some of these ahead more quickly in the facility space. Okay. And we'll end on from digital disappointments to AI adoption. So we said here that we changed, if you look at that kind of middle layer there, we went from 16% having of respondents having flat investment in digital to 38% over the last 12 months. A slightly smaller portion that have significantly increased their digital investment over that time period. I think the challenge here has been that uh, particularly if you look at the Canadian experience, that we've had some very large investments in ERP systems and SIS that haven't gone particularly well in a couple of very notable cases. It hasn't been a smooth experience. We've experimented with new platforms that haven't necessarily worked as well in the Canadian context as was promised. And I think a lot of institutions are coping with that. In the meantime, we have other institutions that really need to upgrade some of their core systems, but a pretty difficult time to have that conversation in what's often in a conservative estimate, the 40 to $50 million range when universities are looking at that. I think the biggest learning coming out of the last 10 years on digital is that the systems don't address the efficiency and effective service effectiveness problems directly. What we see is that um, uh, it's if you have poor processes and you have poor data, deploying new expensive systems on top of them doesn't really lead to any better outcomes. Um, so I think just the big learning across the Canadian sector in our experience has particularly been that you really have to focus on cleaning up processes before you look at the digital transformation. Um, the other thing, of course, on the table for universities right now is an interest, sometimes a pressure to invest in new AI tools in a landscape that's very unclear at this point and can be quite costly. I think when we're talking to a lot of institutions, we're realizing that, uh, even rolling out Copilot across an institution can be well over $10 million dollars a year more in costs. So things like this make it quite challenging for universities to make the business case for in this current environment. I think what we're seeing, whether it's bespoke tools that are using tokens for models that are, kind of local software solutions that are using external models, or if it's things that are more integrated into the current technology like Copilot, we're seeing universities make much more selected pilots and doing a lot more prioritization on where that investment happens instead of just trying to roll out AI solutions more broadly and hope that efficiencies and effectiveness are found and that effectiveness improves on the back of those. So being much more targeted and selective about where that money's spent. So a few things that surfaced in the interviews. So one, it's this VPFNA from a Canadian university saying that it's difficult for people to understand, given the current financial environment, why these investments are happening. But it is becoming critically important in some institutions and with some systems that these investments start to happen because it's raising much larger risks further down the road. From Australia, in the middle here, you'll see that this interviewee said that really having that focus on business cases to highlight the productivity improvements just hasn't worked for them. This is the belief that to transform digital creates productivity gains is not real, and it's more of a hygiene factor. So a lot of skepticism about what's actually achieved on the back of these digital transformations. Again, likely because we've been focusing on just one part of a three-part problem often. It's not just the technology, it's also the processes, it's also the organizational structure that sits behind that as well. And finally, that digital transformation is moving so much faster than universities have ever been able to move, and emphasizing that we really need to get in place an agile model to be able to embrace technology at speed, particularly to align with what students are expecting. Yeah, a few summary points here. Essentially, that we should be treating digital transformations and initiatives as a whole of institution reform instead of just a tech upgrade. I think increasingly, if you look 5 years out, 10 years out, we're going to see technology sit a lot closer to the central administration of the university. Universities won't ever be like corporations. And where they do change to become slightly more similar in terms of how as business practices evolve in the corporate world, it'll take place over a much longer period of time. But you can see some of the things that are happening in the corporate world, like Moderna merging its HR and IT teams. That there will be a lot of different approaches to how we deliver transactional services more broadly in the professional world. This, I think, while universities may not look like that, they may not follow that playbook. I think we will start to see technology sit more central in the administration of any type of organization, and we have to prepare ourselves for that. Um, Again, an emphasis on improving business cases and the practices around those for digital projects. And I think from our perspective, the most important being that it's not just made on an assumption that technology solves problems, that it's still a garbage in, garbage out proposition, like almost all technology we've seen in the past has been. You've got to have good processes and data, the organizational structure and roles to carry to interface with that system to get any benefit out of it. Um, Obtaining student input on digital initiatives also important. I think we're all wandering in the dark a bit in terms of what student expectations are over AI. Right now, it's a lot of bring your own AI on the student part, which has some good and also a lot of bad in it. What are the expectations going to be from the student perspective, and what kind of value can be added by the institution by approaching um, uh, the approaching AI tools at an institutional level rather than expecting or encouraging people to find their own solutions. We've, in the last 2 points, talk about leaning into AI adoption. I just clarify that by saying lean into AI adoption, but in a conservative, prioritized way, and that we have a lot to do as institutions in terms of getting the right governance and security around AI. But also the costs are pretty considerable right now. Those will come down over time. But I think particularly in the current financial environment, we're gonna have to be very selective about where we um, deploy AI solutions at scale and invest in those systems. With that, we will move to any questions you have. I don't think we've seen many more pop up in the chat. We've got one from Alan that I'll let you take, Bruno. And while we're doing that, perhaps a few of the rest of you would like to come through with any questions you'd like to have Bruno and I address.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I think to read Alan's question, that is basically highlighting, I think, in terms of terms 3, which was that the third theme, which talks about having that broader efficiency remit. I think we talked a bit about the importance of that cross portfolio collaboration, the efficiency improvement expertise, basically asking a question of kind of what the other categories are there as well. I think Matthew highlighted a little bit, but in terms of those other skills that I think are increasingly important for professional service leaders or what they're seeking out in their teams is, for example, that emphasis on agile development, stakeholder engagement, data literacy. Those are some of the biggest increases, I think, from a skills perspective that we see. I think interestingly, there's a noticeably drop in kind kind of the business analytics, where I think half of the respondents kind of answered that as being a very high priority. In the prior iteration of the survey, it's down to less than a quarter now. So again, I think that reinforces the emphasis on no longer wanting to measure how the ship is doing, but really kind of needing people with the skills to be able to make change happen within the institution as a point of emphasis there. So I think that kind of stands out there from that broader efficiency remit and having the skills to be able to tackle those difficult questions in the short term.
All right. Don't see any other questions coming through right now. Give it
Me neither.
just another. We'll give it a minute. I'll just in terms of closing comments, while I see if anyone wants to come through. I'll make a few. Bruno, have you come in and add anything that you're thinking? I think it's obviously hugely challenging time for anyone working in higher ed right now. Um, and I think it's one of the challenges in writing reports and doing presentations is to not lean too much into the negative. I think there are a lot of things we can focus on that look quite scary on the horizon. And yet, I think our sector is as important or more important than ever. And while there are challenges, I think we've also seen great demonstrations of solutions, not just from your Canadian peers, but I think from peers in Australia, the UK, and the US as well. There's a lot to learn from and share from across the sector, and we always enjoy being in the middle of that conversation and helping to push it forward. Bruno, any final thoughts from you?
No, I think I was going to reflect kind of the same thing, Matt, in terms of even though kind of the nuances in terms of the challenges are slightly different across the regions, I think a lot of institutions are kind of facing the same headwinds. And I think as much as we like to think that we're kind of special unicorns, at the end, kind of we're a herd of unicorns. And I think the beauty of the sector is that there's a willingness to share insights and collaborate on what that new future looks like. So I think that there's some challenges, but also some opportunities to learn from each other and see what works in each of your own contexts. So I think I was gonna kind of reinforce that point that you made, Matt.
Great. Well, no other questions. So I assume we just told you everything you could possibly want to know. We'll let you get on with your day. If you haven't read the report, we'll make sure you get one in your inbox, a link to it, and hope to see you at the next webinar or conference.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.